Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. Zyrixa had never seen anything like it before. Her antennae twitched in excitement as she entered the Grand Hall, where the annual gala of the Galactic Exchange was held. The evening's festivities were already underway, with a dazzling display of interstellar lights illuminating the ceiling, representing the various planets that had contributed to the evening's event. As a young and ambitious alien from the planet Zygra, Zyrixa had been invited as a guest of honor to this prestigious gathering. The universe had offered countless amazing gifts, treasures, and commodities over the years. But Zyrixa wasn't prepared for the gift she was about to receive. The atmosphere buzzed with the chatter of various species, each more fascinating than the last. Zyrixa was trying her best to maintain her composure as she passed by elegantly dressed delegates of various galactic races. Their robes and shimmering skins glistened under the hall's artificial stars. She was still processing the fact that she'd been invited as a guest, and she intended to make an impression tonight. But when she reached the center of the hall, the attention of the guests shifted. On a raised platform, surrounded by high-ranking representatives, an object was being displayed. It was cylindrical and glowed faintly. Zyrixa couldn't help but glance up at it with curiosity. "Zyrixa, my dear," a soft voice called her name. It was Lady Zekla, an elder from Zyrixa's homeworld and a member of the Galactic Exchange's governing council. "Come closer. The gift you have been waiting for is here." Zyrixa approached the platform, her steps light and her excitement mounting. Her thoughts raced. Was this an ancient artifact? A revolutionary weapon? A rare specimen of some species she hadn't encountered before? As her eyes locked onto the glowing object, she could see that it wasn't any of these things. It was something else. The object slid open with a faint hiss, revealing the creature inside. Zyrixa gasped. It was human. Standing before her was a small, barely clothed creature with smooth, pale skin and large, vulnerable eyes. The human was male, but his physical form was unlike anything Zyrixa had ever seen. His body was small compared to many of the towering beings from different galaxies, and his skin lacked the scales or exoskeletons of the beings she was accustomed to. He appeared fragile, helpless, but at the same time, his piercing gaze bore an intensity she hadn't anticipated. This is your gift?" Zyrixa stammered. Her voice, usually steady and confident, now trembled with confusion. Lady Zekla smiled warmly, her multi-lobed eyes gleaming. "Indeed, this is your birthday present, Zyrixa. A human. You are to be his guardian, his protector. Treat him as a prized possession, an object of great value. A treasure, if you will." Zyrixa's mind was swirling. A human? What could be so special about a tiny, vulnerable creature like this? She had heard the legends, of course. There were whispers among the more secretive corners of the galaxy about the mysterious humans, a species whose power was beyond comprehension, whose abilities could tip the balance of the universe. But to actually witness one in person, she had never expected it. He's not even armed," Zyrixa muttered, her voice still shaking with disbelief. "That is the beauty of it," Lady Zekla replied, her voice almost a whisper now. "Humans do not rely on weapons. They rely on their minds, their willpower, their sheer resilience. This human, Zyrixa, is no ordinary specimen. He has been chosen for you. His potential is vast. I've been told that humans, when pushed to their limits, become extraordinary. And you, my dear, are to be his guide." The human blinked, clearly confused by the conversation around him. Zyrixa's gaze softened for a moment as she observed him more closely. His features were so simple, his hair dark and wild, his eyes curious but slightly fearful. How could something so ordinary, so human, have the power that Lady Zekla suggested? "I don't understand," Zyrixa admitted. "What is so special about him? What am I supposed to do with him?" Lady Zekla gave a cryptic smile, her large eyes twinkling as she looked down at the human. The stories speak of a human's incredible potential when they are placed in the right circumstances. They fight with a ferocity unlike any other species. Their determination to survive is unmatched. And perhaps, just perhaps, he will show you something you never thought possible. Zyrixa looked at the human again, the skepticism still clouding her thoughts. She couldn't fathom how this frail being, with no weapons or armor, could be so powerful. Yet, the more she thought about the legends she had heard of humans, the more she began to wonder if there might be some truth to them. The human's eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, Zyrixa felt something. A sense of defiance? Could it be? Was there something inside this creature, this human, that could challenge her expectations? Before she could voice her thoughts, the human spoke, his voice surprisingly clear for someone who had just emerged from a cylinder. What's going on? Where am I? Zyrixa hesitated, then answered, her voice firm and commanding. You're on Zygra, in the center of the Galactic Exchange. And I'm your guardian. The human's gaze shifted from her to the council members and back to her again. Guardian? Why me? Zyrixa felt a surge of something. Whether it was frustration, excitement, or something else, she couldn't place. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of an adventure she hadn't signed up for, and it was already proving to be more complicated than she had ever imagined. The human seemed to notice her hesitation and took a step forward, his eyes full of curiosity and unspoken questions. Zyrixa had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. Zyrixa's mind raced as she looked at the human, who stood before her with a mix of confusion and curiosity in his eyes. Her antennae flicked nervously, betraying the growing uncertainty within her. She had been given the task of guarding this human. But the thought of having to protect something so fragile, so unlike the other beings she had encountered in the galaxy, felt almost absurd. The crowd around her continued to buzz, murmuring in excitement as they observed the exchange. The various delegates of the Galactic Exchange had been waiting for this moment, the unwrapping of the ultimate gift, but Zyrixa wasn't sure whether she should be grateful or irritated. Why me? The human repeated, his voice rough from his journey. What do you want with me? Zyrixa shot a glance at Lady Zekla, who was standing a few feet away with an enigmatic smile on her face. I'm supposed to protect you, she said bluntly, still unsure of how to explain the situation. But why you? I don't know. The human seemed to assess her for a moment, as if trying to make sense of her words. His dark brown hair was disheveled, and his expression was a mixture of confusion and growing apprehension. His eyes darted to the strange alien creatures around him, as if searching for an answer. Where am I? He asked again, his voice tinged with panic. I don't understand. One moment, I was at home, and now I'm here. Zyrixa couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. She had seen creatures plucked from their homes before, transported across galaxies for research purposes or as part of some diplomatic exchange. But this was different. This human didn't seem to belong to any of the grand schemes of the Galactic Exchange. And yet, somehow, his presence here felt significant. Too significant for Zyrixa to ignore. You're on Zygra, Zyrixa said, trying to keep her voice steady. A planet in the galaxy of Zarthan. The Galactic Exchange brought you here. I was chosen to be your guardian. The human's eyes widened, his breath quickening as the realization settled in. No, this can't be happening. He shook his head, muttering to himself. I need to go back. I need to get home. Zyrixa stepped closer, her towering form casting a shadow over him. You can't go back right now, she said firmly, trying to calm him. I don't know how you got here, but there's no way back, at least not immediately. You're going to have to trust me. She almost recoiled as the words left her mouth. Trust? She barely trusted him, let alone her new role as his protector. The human's face twisted with frustration. Trust you? He stopped himself, taking a deep breath. His voice softened. Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I don't want to be part of any of whatever this is. Just send me home. Zyrixa's mind was already racing, but she didn't have time to answer before Lady Zekla intervened. Zyrixa, you must understand, Lady Zekla said, her voice serene but commanding. You will guide him, and in return, The knowledge and power he offers will be yours to wield. His potential is beyond anything you can imagine. Zyrixa glanced at her, still processing the weight of the elder's words. But what is his potential? What makes him so important? Lady Zekla's eyes gleamed, and her smile deepened. That, my dear Zyrixa, is something you will soon discover for yourself. But know this, there are forces out there who would do anything to control him. That is why you must protect him. You are the only one who can. Zyrixa frowned, feeling a mixture of unease and curiosity. The more she learned about this human, the less she understood. She turned back to the human, who was still looking around the hall, bewildered and on edge. The council members continued to watch silently, their expressions unreadable. They weren't concerned about the human's confusion or fear. They were watching Zyrixa. She was the one chosen to handle this gift. The human took a step back, eyes darting to the exits, but Zyrixa quickly stepped in front of him, blocking his path. You can't leave. Trust me, it's not safe for you out there, she warned, her voice firm but gentle. You'll have to stay with me. We need to figure this out together. His eyes met hers again, a mix of frustration and fear dancing in his gaze. I'm not staying here. I want answers. I don't care what you're telling me. I want to go home. I don't belong here. Zyrixa stood her ground. She knew that, logically, he had no choice. No one just ended up in the Galactic Exchange without consequences. There was no telling who else might be after him, or worse, what kind of secrets he might carry. She couldn't let him slip away. I know this isn't what you expected, she said softly, but we need to get through this. Together. The human stared at her for a long moment. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, suspicion, maybe even anger. But then he lowered his gaze, deflating slightly. Fine, I'll stay. But you better have some answers soon. I'm not going to just sit around like some pet. Zyrixa was caught off guard by his words. You are not a pet, she replied sharply, her antennae flicking in irritation. But you need to understand that you're not in control here. There are forces at play you can't even begin to comprehend. The human's jaw clenched. You don't know what I've been through, he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing in determination. I've survived worse. Zyrixa raised an eyebrow. Was that a challenge? She was beginning to see that this human, fragile as he seemed, wasn't as helpless as he appeared. There was something inside him. Something ferocious. All right, Zyrixa said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I'm beginning to think we're going to get along just fine. She turned and began to walk toward the exit, motioning for the human to follow. But for now, you stay with me. I'll keep you safe. The human hesitated. Then, after a moment's thought, followed her. As they left the hall behind, Zyrixa couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a much bigger story. One that would change everything she thought she knew about herself, the universe, and this human who was not just a gift, but perhaps the key to something far greater. Zyrixa led the human through the labyrinthine corridors of the Galactic Exchange Complex. The vast, shimmering walls were lined with intricate designs, representations of the many races that had contributed to the exchange's lofty ambitions. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. She could feel the weight of the human's gaze on her, the questions and doubts he carried with him, and she wondered how long it would take before he truly realized the implications of what was happening. Or worse, how long before she truly understood it. The human, whose name she had yet to learn, kept his distance. His footfalls echoed softly behind her, each step a reminder of how strange and out of place he was in this alien environment. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by his occasional sighs of frustration and her quiet mutterings as she tried to make sense of the situation. After what felt like an eternity, Zyrixa led him into a small, sterile room with no windows, just a table and two chairs positioned opposite each other. The walls hummed with faint energy, their surface shifting subtly as if responding to an unseen force. It was one of the few places in the exchange where nothing could be sensed, an intentionally neutral space meant for discussions or, as it would soon become evident, tests. Sit, Zyrixa ordered, her voice firm but not unkind. We need to talk. The human hesitated but eventually complied, pulling out the chair and sitting down with an audible creak. His dark eyes, filled with uncertainty and guarded suspicion, met hers, and for a brief moment, there was silence, one thick with expectation. Zyrixa lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her long, segmented limbs folding neatly beneath her. "First things first," she began. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the human answered curtly. He seemed wary, but she sensed a flicker of wariness melting away, replaced with a hint of curiosity. "Daniel Thorne." Zyrixa nodded slowly, the name rolling off her tongue strangely. "Daniel Thorne," she repeated, trying to adjust to the human's simple, earthy tone. "All right, Daniel, let's get something straight. You're not going home anytime soon. That much is clear." She folded her arms across her chest, studying him intently. "The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. His shoulders tensed, but he kept his composure. "I know this is hard to accept," she continued, "but we're in the middle of something bigger than either of us. The exchange didn't just bring you here because they thought you'd be a nice addition to their collection. There's more to you than meets the eye. And right now, my job is to keep you alive until I figure out what that is." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not some experiment," he said quietly, his voice sharp but not entirely unsteady. "I want answers." Zyrixa looked at him, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I don't have all the answers either," she admitted, her voice lower now. "But I know something powerful is at work here, something dangerous. And there are others who would use you for whatever it is that makes you special." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but his eyes never wavered from hers. "You keep saying I'm special. What do you mean by that?" Zyrixa stood and began pacing, her thoughts swirling in an uneasy dance. "The truth is, I don't know yet. But I do know that humans, especially humans like you, are unlike anything the galaxy has seen. There are whispers, rumors among the exchange races, that your species can tap into untapped reserves of power. Something primal." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "A power that others can't control." Daniel scoffed, clearly incredulous. "I don't know about any untapped power. I'm just a guy. A normal guy. I don't even know how I got here. You want to tell me I have some kind of secret ability?" Zyrixa stopped pacing and fixed her gaze on him. "I think you've felt it, haven't you? That feeling that you're capable of more than you know? That when pushed, you can do the impossible." She didn't wait for an answer. "You might not know it yet, but your species has an uncanny ability to survive, to endure in ways that no other race can. That's what makes humans so dangerous." There was a long pause, during which Daniel seemed to digest her words. He glanced down at his hands, as if searching for some clue to his supposed power. "I don't feel any different," he muttered, his voice faint. "That's how it begins," Zyrixa said softly. "It's buried deep, hidden behind layers of doubt, fear, and confusion. But it's there. And one day you'll realize it for yourself." The silence between them stretched longer, and Zyrixa could feel the weight of the moment settling between them. There was something shifting in Daniel's posture, a subtle change that suggested he was beginning to absorb the gravity of her words. Suddenly, the door behind them slid open with a hiss, and Zyrixa's antennae immediately twitched in alarm. A new presence had entered the room, someone she hadn't expected. It was a tall, imposing figure clad in dark armor, the emblem of the Galactic exchange etched across his chest. Zyrixa recognized him immediately. Commander Veller, a high-ranking official known for his cold, calculated demeanor. "Zyrixa," he said, his voice smooth but edged with an underlying threat. "We need to talk." Zyrixa didn't flinch, though she was already calculating her options. The room was neutral, but that didn't mean she was unprepared. "This is a private conversation, Commander," she replied firmly, her tone never wavering. Veller's gaze shifted to Daniel, who was still seated at the table, looking more confused than ever. "And this human?" Veller's lips curled into something that could almost be mistaken for a sneer. "You're guarding him, then?" Zyrixa didn't answer immediately. She met the commander's gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm doing what's necessary," she said slowly. "And I suggest you do the same. This human, he's more than you think." Veller's gaze flickered to Daniel again, a momentary flash of interest passing through his cold eyes. "You've been given an important task, Zyrixa," he said, his voice low. "But don't forget your place. The exchange didn't bring this human here for you to babysit." Zyrixa felt a twinge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept her composure. "I'll decide what's necessary," she said, her voice sharp. "Very well," Veller replied, turning to leave. "But remember, Zyrixa, not everyone will share your attachment to this human." As the door slid shut behind him, Zyrixa turned back to Daniel. She could feel the tension in the room, the weight of Veller's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "I told you," she said quietly, "you're in more danger than you realize." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was starting to understand. The weight of Commander Veller's presence lingered long after he left the room. Zyrixa stood still, her arms crossed, her mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts. The exchange with Veller had unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. The commander's dismissive attitude toward Daniel, combined with his cryptic words, told her that whatever was happening with this human was more than just a diplomatic gift. There were hidden layers, and Zyrixa couldn't ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was watching their every move. Daniel remained seated at the table, his expression still guarded. His eyes flicked from Zyrixa to the door, then back to her. It was as if he was waiting for something more. But what? Answers? Truth? The silence between them stretched thin, suffocating in its heaviness. Finally, Daniel broke it, his voice quiet but steady. "You didn't answer my question. Why me? Why human?" Zyrixa took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time he'd asked, but she hadn't been ready to give a full answer. There was still too much she didn't understand herself. "You don't know what you're capable of," Zyrixa said, her tone softer this time. She couldn't ignore the uncertainty in her own voice. "But I do. You humans, there's something about you, something deep inside. When you're pushed to the brink, you change. You become something else." Daniel's brow furrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might brush off her words as nonsense. But instead, he leaned forward, his hands clenched on the table, his voice low. "Are you saying that you think I've got some kind of superpower?" Zyrixa tilted her head, contemplating how best to explain the situation. "Not exactly. I think you have the potential for something far more powerful, an untapped force within you. It's instinctive, but it takes something extraordinary to trigger it." Daniel snorted, clearly unconvinced. "I don't feel any untapped force. I'm just a guy. A regular guy who doesn't belong here. I didn't ask for any of this." Zyrixa's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation passing through her. She understood the frustration in his voice, the fear that came from feeling powerless. But she had seen it before, humans hiding their true capabilities, unwilling to acknowledge the strength they had until it was too late. She couldn't afford to waste time coaxing him into understanding. "You'll understand soon enough," she said, her voice firm. "And when you do, you'll realize that what's inside of you is what's going to keep you alive." Before Daniel could respond, the door slid open once more, this time more abruptly than before. Zyrixa instinctively stepped in front of Daniel, her posture protective, but it was only a pair of armed guards entering the room. They wore the dark, sleek uniforms of the Galactic Exchange Security Forces, their expressions hard and unyielding. "Zyrixa," one of the guards said curtly, "we've been instructed to escort you and the human to the testing chamber. Immediate compliance is expected." The guard's tone was not one of negotiation. There was no room for argument. Zyrixa exchanged a brief look with Daniel. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of defiance in his eyes. She could tell he was getting fed up, and she didn't blame him. He had been pulled from his life without any explanation, thrust into a world that made no sense to him. But what choice did they have? They could resist, but it would only make things worse. The exchange didn't take kindly to defiance. "I'll go with you," Cyrixa said, her voice a mixture of authority and caution. "But the human stays with me." The guard hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the request, before nodding curtly. "Very well. Follow us." Cyrixa gave Daniel a brief, reassuring look before following the guards out of the room. She wasn't sure what awaited them, but one thing was clear. The time for answers was drawing near. The halls of the Galactic Exchange were cold and sterile, the air tinged with the faint hum of advanced technology. As they walked, the walls seemed to close in, the corridor narrowing, until they arrived at a large, secure door. The guard swiped a badge, and the door slid open with a hiss, revealing a room that looked like it belonged to a high-security research facility. The walls were lined with screens, and the room hummed with an unsettling energy. Cyrixa led Daniel inside, her gaze scanning the sterile room. This was it, the testing chamber. But for what? "Stay close," she muttered to him, her voice low but filled with an unspoken urgency. Before they could process what was happening, the door behind them slid shut with a soft click. The room seemed to be sealed from all sides now, and a voice from above spoke, echoing down into the chamber. "Subject 114B, begin initiation." Cyrixa tensed, her eyes darting to the ceiling. "Initiation?" she murmured to herself. It was too early for this. The tests were supposed to be gradual, methodical, nothing like this. A series of lights flickered on the walls, bathing the room in an eerie blue glow. Then, the floor beneath them began to shift, revealing a set of mechanical restraints. Without warning, tendrils of energy shot out from the walls, wrapping themselves around Daniel's limbs. "Stop!" Cyrixa barked, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved forward, her hand reaching out instinctively to protect him. But before she could react, a series of force fields shot up, blocking her path. Daniel was trapped in the center of the room, his body held in place by the mechanical tendrils. His eyes widened in panic as the restraints tightened, and he struggled against them. "Let him go!" Cyrixa demanded, her voice echoing with authority. She could feel the power of the exchange's systems coursing through the room. They were testing Daniel and her. They had been prepared for her to intervene, but now she had to find a way to stop it. "Cyrixa," the voice from above spoke again, its tone cold and impersonal. "Do not interfere. This test is essential for both you and the human." Cyrixa's gaze shifted back to Daniel, his body tense, his breath shallow as he fought the restraints. It was as if the room itself was testing his limits, pushing him to react. But Daniel didn't just struggle. He was angry. She could see it now. His anger was rising, growing, as if something within him was awakening. "Daniel," Cyrixa whispered urgently. "Fight it. You have to fight it." Daniel's eyes snapped toward her, and something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of defiance, but also something far more dangerous, a primal, raw determination. The restraints held him firm, but Cyrixa could feel the room's energy beginning to pulse. The tension was building, the air crackling with potential. Whatever force it was that the exchange had sensed in Daniel, it was beginning to awaken. And Cyrixa could feel it too. Daniel's muscles tensed as if preparing to unleash something powerful. And then it happened. A surge of energy, primal and uncontrollable, exploded from Daniel's body, snapping the restraints as if they were nothing more than fragile threads. The force was so intense that Cyrixa was thrown back against the wall by the shockwave. Daniel stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He was no longer just a man, he was something more. Cyrixa's heart pounded in her chest. She had known it was coming, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. The room was in chaos. The ground trembled as energy surged around Daniel, wrapping the air in crackling tendrils of raw power. Cyrixa, still recovering from the shockwave, pushed herself to her feet, her senses scrambling to make sense of what was unfolding before her. Daniel stood in the center of the room, his body glowing faintly with an ethereal, otherworldly light. His breath came in short bursts, his eyes wide, filled with disbelief, but also something else. Understanding. The same primal force that had been growing inside him was now pulsing outward, reshaping the very air around him. Zyrixa's mind raced. She had known the human had potential, but this was far beyond anything she had anticipated. The force radiating from Daniel was like nothing she had ever felt before. It was pure, untamed, and terrifying. "Daniel!" Zyrixa shouted, trying to break through the storm of energy surrounding him. "You have to control it. Focus." But Daniel didn't respond. His hands clenched into fists, and the power surged even further, snapping the mechanical tendrils that had once held him captive, sending them flying across the room. The walls around them began to crack, the glowing seams running along the edges of the room's structure widening, as if the energy within him was too much for the room to contain. Zyrixa's antennae twitched in alarm. She could see the force building within him, the wave of power threatening to shatter everything around them. If he couldn't control it, the entire facility would be at risk. The voice from above crackled to life once more, its tone cold and commanding. "Subject 114B, you have exceeded the established parameters." Reverting to containment mode, Zyrixa's eyes snapped to the ceiling. This wasn't just a test anymore. This was a forced escalation. The exchange had expected to measure Daniel's capabilities, but they hadn't anticipated him breaking free like this. And now, the system was reacting with full force, trying to subdue him before the situation spiraled further out of control. But Zyrixa wasn't about to let that happen. The system had been designed to handle dangerous situations, but it hadn't accounted for her interference. It had also underestimated Daniel. "Get back!" Zyrixa shouted as the room began to shift. The walls started to seal, and the floor beneath Daniel began to glow a fierce red, activating some kind of force field that would trap him once again. In an instant, she was at his side, her hand grabbing his arm, trying to ground him. His skin felt warm, like an electric current running through him. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the confusion, the fear. He was out of his depth. "Focus, Daniel," she repeated, her voice a mixture of urgency and command. "You can't let it control you. You have to take control of yourself." Daniel's body trembled. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But then, just as the force field began to close in on him, a flicker of clarity passed through his eyes. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the power inside him had momentarily dissipated. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that brief pause, Zyrixa felt it, the shift. The power didn't subside, but it cooled. It became more focused, less chaotic, as though Daniel had found a way to rein it in. The air around him settled, and the walls ceased their frantic pulsing. Zyrixa released the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The voice from above remained silent, its algorithms evidently recalculating, no doubt baffled by the fact that the subject had regained control. For now, anyway. Daniel blinked, looking down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. His voice was shaky but steady. What just happened?" Zyrixa placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "That was your power. The one I told you about." He glanced at her, still trying to process everything. This was inside me? I didn't even know it existed." Zyrixa nodded. "Humans have it inside them, this strength, this willpower. It's something that can't be replicated by any other species. But when it awakens, it's overwhelming. You have to learn how to control it. Because if you don't, it could destroy you, and everyone around you." Daniel swallowed hard, his expression growing darker. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." Zyrixa sighed, her antennae drooping slightly in sympathy. "None of us are ready. That's the danger of power like this. But you're going to have to learn. And quickly, too." Before they could say anything more, the doors to the testing chamber hissed open. A group of armed officers entered, their uniforms marked with the insignia of the Galactic Exchange. Zyrixa's eyes immediately narrowed. She could tell from their tense posture that they weren't here to help. The lead officer stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Subject 114B has successfully breached containment," he reported flatly. "Initiating secondary protocol." Zyrixa stepped between the officers and Daniel, her posture defensive. "You're not taking him anywhere," she growled. "This is not part of the plan." The officer's eyes flicked to her, and he sneered. "The plan is irrelevant. The subject's power is unstable. He must be contained before he becomes a threat. If you interfere, we'll have no choice but to treat you as an obstacle." Zyrixa's body tensed. The guards around her were closing in, their hands hovering near their weapons, but she wasn't about to back down. She could feel Daniel's unease beside her, but there was something else, a spark of determination beginning to grow in his eyes. "You can't just take him," Zyrixa said, her voice low and fierce. "This is bigger than whatever protocol you're following. I will decide what happens to him." The officer smirked. "Then you leave us no choice." In a blur of movement, the officers raised their weapons. But before they could react, Daniel moved, his body moving faster than Zyrixa thought possible. With a single, fluid motion, he extended his hand toward the officers, and the energy inside him exploded outward in a pulse of intense power. The officers were thrown back, crashing into the walls with a force that shook the entire chamber. The room shook again, and sparks flew from the damaged equipment. Zyrixa's eyes widened in shock as she realized what had just happened. Daniel had controlled it. His power, no longer just a burst of uncontrollable force, had been channeled into something focused and precise. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the broken machinery. The guards groaned, struggling to regain their footing, but Daniel stood still, his breathing heavy. "You did it," Zyrixa said in awe. "You controlled it." Daniel turned toward her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing confidence. "I didn't think I could. But now, I don't know. I feel different." Zyrixa took a cautious step forward. "You've just unlocked something inside you. The power you wield, Daniel, it's unlike anything we've seen before. And it's not just a force to be reckoned with. It's the key." He met her gaze, and in that moment, Zyrixa saw something she hadn't before. A flicker of purpose. It was a small but significant change, a sign that Daniel was beginning to understand the magnitude of his potential. "You're not just a human anymore," she said quietly. "You're something more. And the galaxy is going to take notice." Daniel looked down at his hands once again, as if seeing them in a new light. "Then I guess I'd better learn how to use it." Zyrixa nodded, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. This was only the beginning. The tense silence in the testing chamber stretched on as the last of the armed officers recovered, their bodies slowly pushing themselves upright. They were visibly shaken. The energy pulse Daniel had unleashed clearly more than they had expected to handle. Despite their attempts to regain composure, there was a clear unease in their eyes, a recognition that they had underestimated both Daniel and Zyrixa. Zyrixa took a step toward the now unconscious officers, her gaze cold. The power Daniel had demonstrated had been impressive, but it had also escalated the situation far beyond anything she had anticipated. The Galactic Exchange had protocols for everything, but they had just encountered an anomaly, one they weren't prepared to deal with. The leader of the group, still shaking off the effects of Daniel's blast, struggled to stand and raised his weapon again, but Zyrixa was already in motion. She was quicker, her speed and agility making her a blur as she closed the distance between them in an instant. "You're done here," she said, her voice sharp. The officer froze, caught between fear and authority. He lowered his weapon without protest. There was something in her gaze that made him reconsider any further confrontation. "We'll need backup," one of the other guards muttered, his voice low as he assessed the situation. "Backup?" Zyrixa scoffed, crossing her arms. "Backup won't change anything. You can't control him. No one can, not without understanding what you're truly dealing with." The officer's eyes flickered to Daniel, who stood a few feet behind Zyrixa, his hands still tingling from the residual energy. He looked different now. The earlier panic and confusion had melted away, replaced by a focused determination. "You're right," the officer reluctantly admitted. "We weren't ready for this." Zyrixa glanced at Daniel, then turned back to the officers. "No one is. And if you try to lock him up again, The results will be far worse than what you've already seen. The officer nodded grimly. Understood, Commander. The quiet was suffocating for a moment, before another voice echoed through the comm system. The voice cold and authoritative. Zyrixa, do not assume control of this situation. Return the subject to containment immediately. Zyrixa's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was Veller, the commander who had been overseeing the entire operation. The tone in his voice was as unwavering as ever, but there was an edge to it. A new tension that suggested this wasn't a request. She straightened, not breaking eye contact with the guards, her expression hardening. I'm not handing him over. Not to you and not to anyone else. There was a brief pause before Veller's voice came through again, sharper this time. You don't understand, Zyrixa. You've no idea what you're dealing with. That human, his abilities, they are a weapon. And we cannot allow such power to remain uncontrolled. You're putting the entire galaxy at risk. Zyrixa's lip curled in frustration, but her tone remained steady. I understand more than you think, Veller, and what I don't understand is why you're so eager to contain him. What's your real interest in him? There was a brief silence before the commander responded, the static crackling in the background. The exchange has plans for the human. Plans that you are not privy to. You are to bring him back to headquarters now. Zyrixa's eyes narrowed as she considered his words. There was something more going on here. Something darker that Veller wasn't willing to reveal. She had always been skeptical of the exchange's motives, but this, it felt different. What exactly do you plan to do with him? Zyrixa asked, her voice steady, though the urgency in her heart was growing. You said yourself he's a danger. What happens when that power is unleashed in full? The voice on the comm crackled again, this time with a sharp, commanding edge. That is classified information, Commander. Do not question it further. Bring the human to me now. Zyrixa's breath caught in her throat. She had seen how the exchange operated. There were always secrets, hidden agendas, and Veller's obsession with Daniel only made those suspicions stronger. Without answering, Zyrixa turned to Daniel, who was staring at her with a quiet intensity. His earlier confusion had faded, replaced by a sense of determination. He was no longer the bewildered human thrown into this unknown world. Now he stood as someone who could feel the gravity of the situation. Zyrixa, he said, his voice steady but filled with something she hadn't heard before. Conviction. I'm not going back. Not to them. Her heart skipped at the finality in his words. She knew it was a dangerous stance to take, but she couldn't deny that she shared his feelings. The Galactic Exchange had already shown their hand, and it wasn't one she wanted to be a part of. You don't have a choice, the officer closest to them barked. He was moving toward them again, his weapon raised, though his posture wasn't as confident as before. Zyrixa stepped forward, ready to defend Daniel once more. You're not going to get him. But before the situation could escalate further, Daniel's voice rang out, not with anger, but with an authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. Enough! He stepped forward, his hands raised slightly as if to signal calm. His energy was different now, more focused and controlled, but it was still undeniable. The raw power that had shattered the restraints earlier was still within him. I'm not a weapon, Daniel said, his voice cutting through the tension. I'm a person. And I won't be used. I'm not going back to be a test subject, and I'm certainly not going to let anyone turn me into something I'm not. For a brief moment, the room was silent. Zyrixa watched Daniel, impressed by the newfound clarity in his words. He was no longer just reacting to the situation, he was taking command of it, setting the terms. And for the first time, Zyrixa felt a flicker of hope. If Daniel could maintain control over this power, they might have a chance to make their own decisions. The officer who had raised his weapon earlier hesitated. For a long moment the silence stretched, but before anything else could happen, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside the testing chamber, followed by the distinct sounds of battle. The facility's alarms began to blare, signaling an emergency. The sound of boots stomping down the hall echoed in their ears, and the air grew thick with tension. Zyrixa's hand instinctively went to her sidearm, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Zyrixa nodded, her heart pounding. "It's not just Veller. Someone else is coming." The door to the testing chamber burst open, and a new group of figures entered, this time, not in the familiar black uniforms of the Galactic Exchange, but in sleek, armor-plated suits that were unmistakable. They were bounty hunters. Mercenaries. Daniel stiffened. He had no idea what had just arrived, but Zyrixa's warning from earlier rang in her mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The mercenaries advanced, their weapons trained on the room. "We've come for the human," the leader of the group said, his voice low and menacing. "And anyone who tries to stop us is dead." Zyrixa's eyes narrowed. She had a feeling that Veller's plans were only the beginning of something far bigger, and now, it seemed, the galaxy had come to collect. The door slammed shut behind the mercenaries, sealing them inside the testing chamber. There were 6 of them in total, heavily armored and carrying weapons that could bring down a building, let alone the few of them inside the room. Their leader, a tall, scarred alien with cold red eyes, surveyed the scene with a predator's gaze. "We've come for the human," the leader growled, his voice sending a shiver down Zyrixa's spine. "And we don't take kindly to resistance." Zyrixa's grip tightened on her sidearm, her heart racing. The blast from the weapons in the mercenaries' hands could level the walls around them, and while she had her own skills in combat, she wasn't naive enough to think she could take on a group like this alone. Daniel stood behind her, still visibly shaken but resolute. His presence, once filled with confusion and doubt, now radiated a sense of purpose. He stepped forward slowly, his body crackling with the power that had erupted from him earlier. There was something different in his demeanor, a calm confidence that hadn't been there before. "Zyrixa, I told you. I'm not going back," Daniel said, his voice steady. His eyes flicked to the mercenaries, noting the weapons they carried and the way they were positioning themselves. "And I'm not going to let them hurt anyone." Zyrixa turned to him, locking eyes. "You need to be careful," she warned, her voice urgent. "You've got power, but you don't fully understand it. If you lose control again, it'll be worse for all of us." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a trained fighter. But the power inside him was undeniable, and for the first time he seemed to have a grasp on it. Zyrixa could only hope it was enough. The mercenaries closed in, their weapons raised and aimed directly at Daniel. The leader smirked, clearly underestimating the human. "This is your last warning. Come with us quietly, or we'll make sure you regret it." But Daniel stood his ground, unflinching. He wasn't backing down. "You don't understand," Daniel said, his voice suddenly sharp. "I'm not some prisoner you can just take. I'm not your weapon, and I'm not going to be anyone's tool." With a swift motion, Daniel raised his hand. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, a shockwave of energy exploded from his palm, sending the nearest mercenary flying backward with such force that he crashed into the wall, his armor cracking upon impact. The remaining mercenaries staggered, caught off guard. But the leader, his eyes now wide with alarm, barked an order. "Take him down now." The mercenaries surged forward, firing their weapons. Zyrixa's heart raced as she ducked behind cover, the blinding flashes of plasma fire lighting up the room. The force of their blasts reverberated through the walls, but Daniel didn't flinch. His body moved with newfound precision, every motion deliberate, every step calculated. He extended his hand again, this time with a focused intent. A surge of energy shot out in a concentrated beam, hitting one of the mercenaries directly in the chest. The force sent the alien sprawling to the floor, unconscious, and the others hesitated, shocked by the raw power Daniel could wield. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, his voice booming across the room. His hands trembled with the energy coursing through him, but there was no fear in his eyes now, only determination. Zyrixa watched him with a mix of awe and concern. His control was still tenuous, but there was a clarity in his actions. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was leading the battle, shaping the flow of the fight with every pulse of energy. The mercenary leader growled, clearly recognizing the shift in the power dynamic. He didn't want to lose control of this operation. His soldiers may have underestimated Daniel, but now they could see the human wasn't just a threat. He was a force of nature. The leader raised his weapon, preparing to take another shot at Daniel. But Zyrixa acted in a flash. She drew her sidearm, aimed at the leader's wrist, and fired. The blast sent the weapon flying from his hand, and he stumbled back, startled. "You're not taking him," Zyrixa said firmly, stepping forward to shield Daniel with her body. "This is your last warning." The leader sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't know if he could fight against Daniel's power, and he knew better than to take on Zyrixa in her prime. The balance of the room had shifted irreparably. "I'll call for reinforcements," the leader threatened, his voice now filled with desperation. Zyrixa didn't hesitate. "Then do it," she said, her tone cold. "But they'll be too late." Daniel, his breathing heavy, looked at her. "I can't keep doing this, Zyrixa. What if I can't control it? What if—" She stepped forward, her eyes softening as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can. You're learning, Daniel. You're choosing to control it, not letting it control you." He nodded slowly, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. It wasn't perfect, but he was getting there. The human inside him was fighting not just for survival, but for something more: control, freedom, and his place in this galaxy. The mercenary leader turned to his remaining soldiers. "We'll take him down together," he barked. But as he spoke, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor outside. Reinforcements, yes, but not in the way he had anticipated. Zyrix's eyes widened as the doors to the chamber burst open once more, this time with a force far greater than the mercenaries had expected. A new group entered, dressed in armor that was immediately recognizable. These weren't just soldiers, they were elite forces. Zyrix's heart raced. This was it. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The mercenaries were no longer the threat. They were part of a larger web of control, one that Daniel was at the center of. Daniel raised his hand again, preparing for another burst of energy, but Zyrixa held him back. "Not yet," she whispered, her eyes narrowing. "We need a plan." The leader of the mercenaries, seeing the new threat closing in, looked at Daniel one last time, his gaze filled with regret. "This isn't over, human. You can't outrun what's coming." Daniel's gaze was steady, resolute. "I don't need to outrun anything," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I'll face it head-on." The battle for control, for freedom, and for survival was far from over, but for the first time Zyrixa felt hope. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their future. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.